I am Keith Reopelle. Thank you for that kind introduction, Chuck. I am the director of the newly created Office of Energy and Climate Change in Dane County. Truth be told, I'm the director and I am the Office of Energy and Climate Change in Dane County. So I get to tell myself what to do, which can be frustrating sometimes. No, I first of all want to thank the steering committee members, the leadership here, Roy and Mary and Dick and Chuck and all the others for this opportunity. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you today about what Dane County is doing. And I'm going to try to do two things. Number one, continue where I think Tim left off in terms of giving you some positive stories and hopeful ideas in terms of action on climate change. As Roy said at the outset, there's plenty to be depressed about, but there's also a lot of things to be excited about, and hopefully I'm going to be able to share some of those. And the other thing is just, I thought I would try to take a very practical approach and just describe what we're doing in Dane County, and with the notion that I think most of it certainly is very translatable. Most of it could be done in cities here, at the county level in Door County. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the process, and then I'm going to talk about some of the exciting projects that we have in the works, things that again, some of them are unique to Dane County and cannot be replicated, but most of them can be. As Tim gave you a few points about La Crosse, I wanted to just give a few points about Dane County. It's, as I think you know, it's the second largest county in Wisconsin in terms of population. It has a high growth rate. The economy's doing pretty well in a relative sense. It has low unemployment, that sort of thing. I think one of the things a lot of folks don't know, but what's really important to our work is that it's actually the biggest agricultural producing county in the state of Wisconsin. And actually, if you just add up all the gross receipts for all of the goods, agricultural goods, it is the highest. And that has some real ramification in terms of both limitations and opportunities for what we can do on climate change. It's just an interesting fact, I think, that Madison is one of the only two major cities in the U.S. located on an isthmus. I'm going to continue with this water theme, and just who can shout out which is the other one? Major city that's located on an isthmus. Turns out to be Seattle, so it's technically on an isthmus. And I just threw the Effigy Mountains thing in there because I found it and I thought it was really interesting. It's not really relevant to, indirectly related, I suppose, but too relative. So the other thing I want to say just in terms of Dane County and setup is it is obvious that Door County is all about water, and that water defines, you know, the industry and the culture and so many other things about Door County. We just heard about how that is also very true for the city of La Crosse. And you might not think about it as much for Dane County and some of the cities in Dane County, but it's really true there as well. That isthmus thing is kind of an interesting point. So actually, just like with La Crosse, our city is literally laid out the way it is because our biggest city, because of the lakes. But I think the lakes are really what people identify with the most in Dane County, just in terms of the environment and to a large degree the culture. The picture that I have there on your right is, I just also need to say, Dane County is doing some really cutting edge things in terms of water quality. They've been working for many, many years to reduce the nutrient loading into the Yahara River system and the Madison lakes. And while they were doing that work by reducing polluted runoff, reducing manure applications, they were monitoring the nutrient levels in phosphorus, which is the critical nutrient, in the water, and realizing that it just wasn't going down. It was sort of staying, I mean, it fluctuated a lot, but even though the loading was being reduced, the concentrations were the same, they realized that there's this legacy phosphorus in the sediments that's released all the time, and so much has accumulated there. And that little boat and that crew is doing, it's a project called Suck the Muck. They're literally taking the sediments out from the bottom of this tributary creek and taking the phosphorus out of the sediments and putting the sediments back into the water system. So that's what I mean about some really high-tech, cutting-edge things in terms of water resources. So I did feel like I needed to say a little bit about the Office of Energy and Climate Change. I think it's a unique office in Wisconsin at the county level anyway. I hope there are others, or there will be others in the future, but I basically have two responsibilities. One is to work with the county departments to reduce their carbon footprint. That's kind of on the back burner right now. The other and the bigger responsibility is to create a climate action plan for Dane County, not just our operations and facilities, but county-wide, economy-wide, the entire private sector, everybody, and come up with that climate action plan. Fortunately, a lot of work had been done in Dane County before I came on board about a year ago, so there was a lot of great information. The first bullet there was actually already a climate council and a climate action plan written, and it was all about climate impacts and adaptation. And so for that reason, now I'm going to talk about resiliency in our climate action planning, but our focus is our primary focus is mitigation. We're looking at adaptation and filling in some gaps, but we already have a really good report, and it's you see the cover on the left there. We have a baseline inventory. Some of Greg's students have put together some great reports on specific practices and things we can do to reduce our carbon emissions in Dane County. We just last summer, our Department of Emergency Management produced a natural hazards mitigation plan, which has a lot of great, again, information is particularly about resiliency and adaptation, and we've invested in just a ton of specific clean energy projects. And in terms of Dane County's operations and facilities, we actually, this graph which you see here is our electric load, the power consumption on your left, and then the different sources of renewable energy on your right. And this is dated, it's 2016. At this point, we actually we more than offset all of our electric energy usage with renewable resources. The vast majority of it is methane gas from one of two landfills, from our larger landfill, and as Tim pointed out, you could debate whether that's actually renewable, but it's not from fossil fuels. And the solar piece here has grown tremendously. It's the reason I say I know we're well beyond. We actually have solar arrays on 15 of our buildings, our county facilities, county buildings. So the whole point, and County Executive Joe Parisi has been a huge leader in all environmental topics, really, but he kind of looked at this in the fall of 2016 when they were putting together the budget and said, okay, we've done a good job of sort of looking at our own house in terms of clean energy. Now we need to go county-wide. I mentioned 2 slides ago that there was an inventory already created, and that also is extremely helpful. It's important to distinguish in terms of emissions, the emissions that emanate directly from activities in Dane County and associated with our activities. And here's what I mean by that. This is the emissions inventory of carbon emissions and other greenhouse gases coming out of Dane County. You see agriculture is actually the largest, and that goes back to that the statistic, the fact that it's a huge dairy producing county. Transportation is second, and those two make up by far the greatest amount of emissions. And you don't see power sector being that big, and that's because we import the majority of our electric power into Dane County. There are some power plants there. MG&E has a couple of power plants, and there are a number of renewable facilities I talked about, but most of it is imported. So in our climate action plan, we're not just going to look at the emissions literally coming from Dane County, but we're going to look at all the emissions that we cause, basically. So our demand, so if you look at it that way, then the power sector is the largest source of emissions. And we know the power sector, agriculture, and transportation are the areas we have to pay the most attention to. So a little bit about the process of how we're doing that. We've created a climate council, and so we have about 35 organizations. It's actually still growing a little bit. And you can see there's a pretty significant diversity in terms of the different types of entities we have. There's actually a lot of utilities with service territory in Dane County, but Alliant Energy, MG&E, and WPPI certainly make up the vast majority of it. There's a lot of businesses, including the Madison Chamber, which represents thousands of businesses. There's a number of equity and justice organizations, ag groups. The University of Wisconsin is well represented. And really what this group is sort of tasked with doing is coming up with a climate action plan that, the way I like to talk about it is, puts us on a path to deep decarbonization. Basically what the scientific community is telling us, they have been saying for a long time, we have to keep warming to a maximum of 2 degrees Celsius by about mid-century, and now they're saying actually it looks like more like 1.5 degrees Celsius is what we need to be shooting for. And to do that, we need to reduce our carbon emissions by somewhere between 80 and 100% by mid-century, essentially. So we'll put a finer point on that range later in this process. And the other thing to know about this is it will be a consensus. It is a consensus process, and the implication of that is the climate action plan we come up with will be supported and endorsed by all those entities you saw represented on the council, which is really important when it comes to implementing all of those programs and policies we'll come up with, right? I like to say that this is the most important slide that I have in this presentation, and I've done variations of this, though not exactly this presentation anywhere, but there's 5 what I like to think of as principles that we're going to adhere to when we come up with the various policies and programs that will make up our climate action plan. And the first one is economic benefits. And I mentioned a little bit about the Dane County's economic situation at the outset, in part to sort of highlight the fact that regardless of how well the economy is doing, the jobless rate, we still believe that identifying, projecting, and then monitoring and reporting out the economic benefits of the investments we'll make as part of this climate action plan is absolutely critical to how we talk about it, to the story that we're creating and the story we're going to tell. The same thing with health benefits. There are going to be numerous health benefits as a result of the investments we make to reach deep decarbonization. We want to be sure to highlight those. They're critical for the community. Racial equity and justice is another critical principle. And really what this means for us is that all the climate solutions we come up with in this process that eventually will be in our climate action plan, all of those solutions need to be available to everybody in Dane County, no matter what their economic situation is, no matter what race they are, but everybody can benefit, see those economic and health benefits is another critical one. The fourth one I like to call bridging the rural and urban divide. You can think of this as plainly as we need to focus at least as much attention on the rural parts of Dane County as we do on Madison. That Madison tends to get most of the attention in Dane County, and we have to be sure not to leave the rural communities behind in this process. And then the last one I frame as energy security. That's really kind of limiting. It's really more resiliency. A lot of the actions we take to mitigate the emissions will also have some resiliency, and we want to maximize the resiliency benefits of those actions. So I talked about the fact we have this large council, and then underneath the council, you can think of it that way, it's actually more like beside the council, but we have at this point 10 different working groups. So these are different from the council. The council is all about stakeholder representation, and this is really all about expertise. So each of these groups has somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 12 individuals who have some expertise in each of these areas. The first 6 are kind of issue-based, and the first 6 are all coming up with different recommendations for policies and programs that they will advance to the council, and the council will take action on. The last 4 of them there are more process-oriented, and they will work with the others, the adaptation group, to maximize the resiliency of their recommendations. Public engagement, we're going to have a lot of programs we're creating, and we're going to need a lot of public outreach and PR to get uptake with those programs. We're going to model everything with some highly sophisticated modeling to ensure that when we say we're going to get to X level of carbon emission reductions by the year 2030 or 2035, we actually can show how we're going to be able to do that. And financing is probably the most important conversation, because we're a county, we can't legislate our way to deep decarbonization, we can't regulate the utilities, so we're going to have a lot of voluntary programs, there's no getting around that, but they're going to take resources to administer and roll out, so financing will be critical. This slide just talks about different criteria. I've mentioned a lot of them already. These are sort of the filters, each of the ideas that those working groups come up with for different programs or policies will go through a filter of each of these as a filter. So what are the carbon emission reductions? What's the cost? What are the economic benefits? What are the equity concerns or benefits associated with that idea? Ecosystem benefits you heard a whole lot about in the first presentation today. So I've gotten through most of the process stuff. This is where it gets a little more interesting. I can share some of the ideas and recommendations that have come forth from those working groups and that that our council is contemplating right now. So folks, I'm sure most folks in this room are familiar with the Focus on Energy program. It's the statewide energy efficiency and small-scale renewable program. You give rebates to make investments in your home or your business. So we want to really, in some ways, create a county-level program of that type because Focus on Energy is incredibly limited. The percentage of business and homeowners that are able to take advantage of it because of the size and magnitude is very limited. So we want to expand that greatly. We have a electric generation working group you saw up there, and that group is looking at solar power, wind power. Geothermal is really a heating, but they're also looking at the supply side of heating. And they went through an interesting exercise at the outset of their work. They said, what if we met all the electrical demand? There's some 53 million kilowatt hours of demand for Dane County. I'm sorry, that's just the operations, but looking economy-wide, it's a much bigger number. So what if we looked at all that demand and we met it all by wind power? How many wind turbines would that take? Did the same exercise for solar power. If we met all of our electric demand, all the businesses and homes in Dane County with just solar, what would it take? Well, it turns out in terms of solar capacity, how much solar we'd have to develop, it would take 3,600 megawatts of solar capacity to meet all the demand. So then the group said, well, if we're going to get to 100% renewable energy, which we need to do to get to deep decarbonization, then we should assume we're going to have to get at least a third of all of our electric power from solar. So they created a goal of 1,200 megawatts of capacity, of solar capacity. That doesn't all have to be in Dane County to serve Dane County. Most of our electricity comes from outside the county anyway, so it wouldn't need to be. But it's a sort of a staggering amount. To give you an idea of kind of the land use implications of that, 1,200 megawatts, we have an RFP out right now for solar at our airport. We have 40 acres that the county owns that we put out an RFP to develop solar. That 40 acres fully developed will give us about 8 megawatts. So 1,200 is a lot, but if you look at all the land, if you assume that's got to be mostly on farmland, and this is why I mentioned at the beginning the agriculture, the prominence of agriculture in Dane County, this is a tough nut right here because that farmland is very valuable, of course. But that 1,200 megawatts, if you just do the math, it comes out to basically 1.3% of all of our ag land would need to be covered with solar panels to get there. This proposal from this working group was just for utility scale solar. Okay, this doesn't really envision. They will have another recommendation on the rooftop solar, distributed energy, smaller scale solar that individual homeowners put up. But anyway, that's what it's going to take, something on that order. We have a recommendation with a lot of different permeations of storage. I was really glad to see, Greg, in your presentation that you had that storage was you believe on a similar path to solar already, and that's critical in terms of getting to 100% renewable energy anyway. We have an ag, forestry, and food working group, and they've advanced a proposal on afforestation and reforestation, and a lot of that is about, I think this is so fascinating, a lot of it is about things like forest farming, which is a notion of certain crops can do fine under certain canopies, and you could have a forest with an agricultural base, kind of underneath it. I think in a place like Door County where you have, a lot of fruit trees and that sort of thing, it's an interesting concept. There's also a thing called ally farming, which is the notion of you have rows of agriculture, rows of crops, annual crops or whatever they might be, and then rows of trees, and then crops and trees and crops and trees. And research shows that you actually end up, it actually ends up being more productive for the crops. Probably you need to be planting the right types of crops. But anyway, we have Dane County leases out, Dane County purchases a lot of land, mostly for watershed protection and for parks and recreation and trails. But we at this point have 3,000 acres of land that we've purchased for future uses that we haven't been able to develop yet, and we just lease them out. Right now, I'm sure it's corn and soybean. We lease them out to farmers, and they're probably being planted in corn and soybean. So we're hoping that we have some property that we can at least do some pilots and investigate some of these different agricultural systems, which will lead to more afforestation. Our Transportation Land Use Working Group has a really big, robust recommendation on electric vehicles. We really need to build out the electric charging infrastructure if we're going to get to the high levels of electrification, and they have a goal of 50% electric vehicles that all of the fleet, I mean all the cars period, are electric by 2040, and that we'll see with our modeling, but we may need to be more aggressive than that. But at any rate, in order to do that, the group is recommending, and Madison in particular, and Dane County also in general, is ahead of most other places in terms of charging infrastructure. There's already a lot of electric chargers, but they're saying we need at least 15, in the near term, in the next 5 to 10 years, we need 15 more DC fast chargers and 150 more what are called level 2 chargers, which they take longer. It's where you would be parked in one place for several hours, that sort of thing. But they also have very specific recommendations on construction that is charger ready, so particularly in multi-family type dwellings and large apartment buildings, having charging infrastructure required, and that sort of thing. And a lot on VMTs, vehicle miles traveled, and reducing those yet to come. You need both of those. And lastly, I'll say, because it's a big thing in Dane County, the county has also done a lot in the transportation and its own fleet and its own facilities. So Dane County actually has pumping of compressed gas from our landfill. So we take that methane gas, it's compressed, and we have 75 of our heavy-duty vehicles, think about snow plows and dump trucks and that sort of thing, already run on compressed methane from the landfill. We're going to greatly expand that for both other municipal fleets and private fleets. A lot on energy efficiency and new construction guidelines and that sort of thing, and I talked about the RNG there already. So hopefully some of these ideas are good. I mean, at this point, a lot of what I just went through on that slide are all ideas. This is maybe one of the best good news slides I think that I have. So this is the MISO Q, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator is the operator of the electric grid in Wisconsin and throughout a lot of the Midwest. And they have this thing called a Q. If a solar or wind developer wants to build a wind farm or put up a large solar array, they need to make sure that MISO views it as a place where they can interconnect in the grid. It does not hurt the grid's ability to provide reliable electricity. So they eventually have to go to the Public Service Commission for permits, but first they have to go to MISO. And they have this thing called a Q, which is basically, these are projects around the state, you can see, that developers, solar and wind developers, and even some storage developers are planning, and these are in just different stages of planning. They're kind of hopes and aspirations right now, although many of these developers are spending a lot of money to line up the landowners that they would need for the solar array, and even to get the permits from the PSC they would need, in hope that a utility like Roy mentioned, We Energies is already stated they're going to buy 350 megawatts worth of solar, and that single announcement drove a lot of this, I'm sure. But anyway, the bottom line is there are 4,200 megawatts worth of solar projects in the MISO Q. So there are developers who have identified the sites and begun to develop the sites for 4,200 megawatts worth of solar in Wisconsin. Not all those projects will be built, but likely a whole bunch of them will. I have a couple of slides about resiliency. I mentioned that natural hazards mitigation plan that our emergency department put together. It lists, shows a location of vulnerable facilities. These are just healthcare facilities. It also shows the location of all critical facilities in the county. This is a really complicated map because it shows the utility service territories, and then it shows the critical utility facilities, electricity, water supply, communications. And so we're looking at these maps in these areas, and this is just a setup for the last substantive slide I have, which is the one after this one, I believe. So I'll come back to those vulnerable and critical facilities. But another type of mapping and resiliency that we're looking at, I've mentioned equity and justice already. There's a group in the Twin Cities that has mapped out what they call energy poverty. And this is basically a map of Minneapolis showing where people have the toughest time paying their energy bills. So the darker red areas mean that their energy bills are disproportionately higher compared to their income. That's another important overlay. So some of the additional initiatives and things we're talking about, those last three maps, we're looking at factors like that right now and thinking about, you hear about microgrids, the godfather, I just learned on this job of microgrids, is a professor at the University of Wisconsin. That is his nickname, Bob Lassiter, but he's one of the leading researchers in the world on microgrids. He's doing all his work in places like Hawaii and other places now, but microgrids are really expensive. We're looking at something that we're calling for now clean energy districts. We're looking at those critical and vulnerable facilities. We're looking at places that we would be able to locate renewable resources, maybe locate charging stations, locate in particular storage, energy storage, so that we can back up and improve the resiliency of those critical facilities and those vulnerable facilities. So another thing that we have 5 municipalities on our council, cities of Madison, Middleton, Monona, Fitchburg, and Sun Prairie. And we have another working group that I didn't have up there, which is made up of those municipalities that come together and share best practices. And you know, the thing they're talking about right now is these resolutions that have been passed. Tim mentioned signing on to a national commitment of mayors for 100% renewable energy. Well, more and more communities you hear about passing their own resolutions committing to 100% renewable energy. Madison did that a year ago. Middleton has it all drafted and is sort of poised to do it very soon. And Fitchburg and Monona are also very interested in such resolutions. And so the interesting thing about that is, you know, it helps to create this demand. It definitely gets the attention of utilities. It's not a binding thing. It's not a law. It can't be, because they can't control that. But it's basically saying that, you know, they're going to go out and look for renewable energy. And again, it's one of these things that is going to, it's creating market demand, and it's going to cause more developers to look more closely to those areas for more projects. This is my last slide. I mentioned that we're a county. We can't legislate our way to deep decarbonization, so we're going to have to be really creative. And I honestly believe that the thing we have going for us the most is really the diversity of the different folks we've brought together, the different types of businesses, the different types of organizations. And I think having diversity and being diverse and inclusive about involving the community in plans like this is really critical to success. So it remains to be seen years from now how successful we'll be. But, and I should also just close with the fact that Joe Parisi, again, our county executive, my boss, he addressed the Climate Council at their very first meeting last summer, and he basically said, so I want you to do, I want you to come up with a climate action plan that makes Dane County a national leader in addressing climate change, in mitigating our emissions, bringing down our emissions. So we want you to shoot high. And then realizing that, you know, again, we're a county, he said, And I want you to focus on the art of the possible. I want you to, really, not come up with ideas that require changes in state law, because that is going to be extremely difficult in the near term, particularly. So it comes back to this idea of we're just going to have to be very creative about the types of programs we create, about the types of marketing we do, all of the things I talked about there. So anyway, that's just a slide there to point that out. Thank you again for the opportunity to talk to you all today. Thanks for coming out. Appreciate it.